So in their anthology, Writing Appalachia, Catherine Letford and Teresa Lloyd, which is, by the way, the first kind to appear in almost 2 decades. So there's not been a lot of anthologies on Appalachia in general, and especially not a lot that focus on anything pre-20th century. So they write that Appalachia is complicated and that the rich complexity is worth celebrating and studying. And as you can tell by my taking part in this lecture series today, I quite agree. While my usual research on Appalachia is way more contemporary, I was quite excited to take a deep dive into the history of this unique region of the United States, so that I can actually invite you today to join me on a bit of a journey into the literary history written by and about women that is about as rocky as the landscape that it emerged from. My roadmap is somewhat to talk a little bit about the concept of women writers, the Appalachian South, what that means, to talk about what that region is like in the 19th century, and then I'll introduce you to some of the writers, some in more depth, some in a little depth, and then I'll share some final thoughts. And ideally afterwards you want to go and buy Writing Appalachia and read more from them, or well, if not the 19th century, at least the 20th century, because that's actually a little more exciting, at least to me. But let's jump right in. So I'll first share a couple of thoughts on really, yeah, what women writers are, and this sort of palimpsest that Appalachia is, and of course even the little more, even more complexity of the Appalachian South, which alongside so many scholars I've been grappling with for the longest time. I'll move on to a sort of historical contextualization of the Appalachian South, because there are lots of things happening in the region at the time that reflect and sort of preempt the nation building underway all over the continent. And from there, we'll look at what sort of writing means in a region that is actually, until today, prevalent in terms of illiteracy, and there's a lot of oral traditions, not so much writing, actually. And at the same time, the region is sort of a key ground for the emergence of regionalism and naturalism as very distinctive literary genres that are profoundly linked to the understanding of the region itself. In this rich context, I'll introduce a few of the women and that I believe are sort of exemplifying the region and also the writing within it. And finally, I'll just talk a little bit about Appalachian studies and what that means. The slightly vague title of my talk speaks, I hope, to the challenge of understanding what women writing in the Appalachian South actually means. Meanwhile, the Appalachian South is a vague term, and I shall return to that issue later on. Meanwhile, the act of writing is a little more clearly defined, yet when looking at the 19th century South, a definition of writing as the physical act of putting a pen to paper would directly eliminate half, if not really all, women who have found their way into the literary history of the region. Of the actual women writers who engaged with the Appalachian South in the 19th century, several did not hail from there or indeed ever lived in the region. In fact, illiteracy was and continues to be extremely high in the mountains. Many of the writers, including women who have written in and about the Appalachian South, have come from places far away. At the same time, voices who hailed from the region have not necessarily become writers, which particularly includes Cherokee and Black women. I still consider these voices, however, fundamental to the Appalachian South, and their experiences have written themselves into the region's history. Though perhaps not with pen on paper, they make up an essential part of the narratives that form the thread from which the rich tapestry of Appalachian writing even today has been woven. Therefore, I'll include both actual writers who have created articles, books, sermons, sort of pleas, and diaries and letters, and are therefore writers in the broad sense of storytellers. Before we can meet them, though, let me introduce you to the madness that is the Appalachian South. Geographically and conceptually, debate over the question what Appalachia is run high. In the 1970s, David Wisnund, a prominent historian of the region, declared that the search for the true borders of Appalachia had already become futile. Of course, this has not stopped historians, geographers, social scientists, and indeed literary scholars to attempt a definition. Maps of Appalachia have been drawn up based on geographical and geological features. Later political and economic considerations produced even more maps. Claims to Appalachia as a distinctive cultural region led scholars to draw even more different borders. So in 1984, in his report on the issues and trends in the region, Appalachia and American Tomorrow, Richard Couto finally suggests a definition of Appalachia, which, and I quote, cannot be found on a map. By this definition, Appalachia is less of a place and more of a process of economic development and exploitation, which happened in a particular region over time. This definition anticipates the postmodern approach to the region employed by historian Alexander Williams, who considers Appalachia a zone characterized by the interaction of global, local, human, and environmental forces, which can only be studied in very specific moments and places. Therefore, my own understanding of Appalachia, which is the basis of this talk, lies somewhere between an actual place on a map and an immensely powerful cultural construct of the region that transcends empirical versions. Geographically speaking, Appalachia is a mountain system that stretches all the way from upstate New York to the northern parts of Alabama and Georgia, encompassing among its most prominent parts the Great Smoky Mountains, of course, the Blue Ridge, the Shenandoah Valley, and the Piedmont region. Geologically, the range extends even further to Canada in the north and Florida in the south, when they were first raised by a push from the continental drift about 65 million years ago. What were once potentially the highest peaks in a newly emerged American continent, erosion has lowered to about 60,000 feet at the highest elevations. So compared to the continent's youngest mountains, the Rocky Mountains, which come in about 14,000 feet, they're tiny by now, but they're very extensive, so people still consider them mountain ranges. The first people to arrive in the region about 16,000 years ago were the ancestors of the Cherokee and the four so-called civilized tribes of the American South. These indigenous groups left a few remnants in the thickly forested hills of Appalachia, which must have been a great hunting and gathering ground. The Cherokee were actually the first ones to cultivate the land by burning off small lots at the river bottoms and steep valleys for farming, but also they relied very heavily on a rich bounty provided by what is one of the most biodiverse regions on this planet. The first European colonial settlers arrived in about the mid-17th century and lived very similarly as subsistence farmers in the valleys, using the woods for hunting and foraging. Many of them were actually squatters on the land that had been given to wealthy plantation owners and royal arrivals in New England, without these people ever setting foot on it. This includes George Washington, by the way, who never went down there but owned like half of Kentucky. But that's actually a story for another time because that becomes very important in the 20th century. So jumping back into the beginning of the 19th century, and the wild frontier for the Appalachians had remained a natural barrier to the colonization of the inner continent for almost the first 150 years of European colonization, especially from the Atlantic side. So there were coming people from the Pacific side and from down below, but from the Atlantic side, Appalachians were sort of the end of the world. So behind that, white maps. But they become reduced as an obstacle, soon to be overcome, because the westward expansion of a newly independent American elite alters the coexistence of indigenous groups and subsistence farmers that had also begun to sort of populate. So in an attempt to find a place within the new nation, many indigenous tribes had at least partially adapted to the customs of the colonizers, and intermarriage between Cherokee and European immigrants was really common, quite unique for in other parts of the nation that wasn't happening. Civilization of the southern tribal groups meant that disenfranchisement of women, who had played a very important role in the Cherokee nation, the adoption of Christianity, patriarchy, and in very many cases also slavery. So Cherokee hold Black people in enslavement at the time to prove that they're civilized people, to the farmers and entrepreneurs around them. There are many carefully constructed narratives claiming that slavery had not yet existed in meaningful ways in the mountains. Although enslaved people were not quite outnumbering white people and indigenous people as they did in the southern lowlands, with its big plantations, small-scale slaveholding was really common to the area, which is now Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia, as well as, of course, the northern states. Early entrepreneurs in timber and salt mines, but also farmers, kept enslaved workers in very small numbers, in addition to indentured servants and poor immigrants arriving in very steady streams from poorer regions in Europe, including Scotland and Ireland, but also parts of what is now Germany. Most of these slaves were women or children, who served as sort of household additions or helped work the fields, but nothing compared to, the big plantations on the Mississippi. Contrary to the very romantic tales of mountain folks living an independent and rugged life in an egalitarian society, social class differentiation, as Billings and Blee elaborate in their very, very interesting book, The Road to Poverty, The Making of Wealth and Hardship in Appalachia, is quite a historical feature of Appalachia. Especially land ownership established the relations of power and spheres of influence that would shape the entire 19th century in the mountains. And that would profoundly impact the development of Appalachia to the negative. And I feel like I have a slide for that. Yeah. So while in the early 19th century, the Appalachian Mountains are still sort of an unsurpassable wilderness, the beginnings of a tight-knit community that would become the hotbed of the infamous feuds of Hatfield and McCoy, you might have heard about in like modern television shows. They're really quite popular. Sorry, now I got lost. So the tight-knit communities sort of already start to exist, and these produce a stereotype that will dominate sort of regional writing. As the 19th century progresses and expansion of colonial settlement transforms the entire American continent, Appalachia is split into what will become very distinct subregions following the Civil War. So the onset of systematic industrialization of the North, and the North winning the war and investing heavily into Southern resource exploitation ends Appalachia's isolation from mainstream progress really abruptly. The mountains of what was now known to be central and southern Appalachia held the key to the solution for the new energy demand of the growing nation, namely coal. Soon, train tracks would be blasted into the mountains, and the Appalachian region would become one of the most densely populated rural areas ever to develop in the United States. So at the end of the 19th century, coal towns and timber camps actually littered the mountains, attracting heavy in-migration by freedmen, European immigrants from the ghettos of the northern cities, and also native people who adopted and assimilated to Western lifestyle. The boom phase of coal and timber would alter the landscape and the communities of Appalachia forever, degrading social and environmental conditions to what soon will feel like a point of no return. Meanwhile, the textile mills in the Piedmont region of southern and northern Carolina, as well as the salt works of Western Virginia and Kentucky, had introduced industrial production and the social cohesion related to it to the population of the Appalachian South. From this emerges a literary tradition that engages with the stereotype of the region as the home of the rebellious and the strong-minded, yet usually hardworking people. Labor and union songs, sermons, and speeches. In fact, the union and labor history of the region may very well be one of its strongest narratives that has been spun in many directions, both positive and negative. At the time, the effort to unionize miners and mill workers, however, was often considered heroic, although somewhat archaic. One of the women I will introduce to you later, Mother Jones, can be considered a particularly famous figure that is even invoked today in a lot of protests, but by far she was not the only one. As most workers could not read or write, their stories, along with their creations, such as songs and speeches against mining, have become part of an oral history record that mostly lives without known authors, however. So the late 1870s and 1880s also saw a burgeoning travel and eventually, quote-unquote, tourist industry. The tourism related to those two foundational narratives of the Appalachian South. On the one hand, the yearning for the rugged individualism and the frontier trials that made a true mountaineer drove particularly men from the cities to test themselves in such truly masculine traits as bear hunting and mountain climbing. As a consequence, books such as Horace Cappert's Our Southern Highlander became instant smash hits. The tendency to conceive of nature as the shaping force which men true or alternatively bad became a very prominent feature of writing in and about the Appalachian South. To this day, many tales that take place in Appalachia or are about Appalachia employ the tropes that first became popular in this type of naturalist writing. People of Appalachia are strongly shaped by the isolation of the mountains that prevent them from partaking in modernity, and that has made them, in the worst case, incestuous and rendered them the deplorable imbeciles that, for example, Hillary Clinton didn't think important to the nation. On the other hand, the end of Reconstruction in the South sort of increased racial tensions and decreased the interest in mission work for the poor Black souls that recently have been freed and that were migrating north anyways, so nobody cared. In its place, missionaries and uplift organizations began to focus on the poor white folks of Appalachia, whose misfortune was a blame on the superiority of the white race that needed to be remedied. At this point, we sort of see the introduction of the narrative that Appalachia is this magical repository of the white race, where only Scots-Irish people live there, and they all speak a pure form of truly Elizabethan English, and all of these sort of really disturbing narratives emerge in that time. And in addition to the accounts by missionaries, journalists and reporters began to venture into the region to investigate the backwaters of modern civilization and write reports that were sometimes favorable, but mostly less so on the people of Appalachia. Most of the travel writing and journalistic work that covered the region focused on the conditions in the coal camps, which were generally degrading, and the iconic tales of the feuds and the bloody kinship wars. But as every old wives' tale has a truth at heart, these stories obviously covered true conditions and events, but ignored the underlying causes. I've mentioned it before, absentee ownership in the mountains was far spread, meaning that landholders were often located far away from the region, caring little for what happened to the land and only caring for its money value. In addition, something that's very unique to the region, there's a separation of mineral rights and surface ownership, which leaves a lot of farmers destitute who had signed away their mineral rights on so-called broad deed forms, which allowed the extraction of coal below their land at any cost to the surface level, essentially destroying the region and therefore what people had been living on. Surface land, which had become anyways eroded by the overuse, were therefore becoming even less available. With as few farmable land as there was, which was mostly located at the river bottoms because we're talking very steep hills, population increase wasn't an option, yet because people were poor and needed people for income, they would have more and more children. Classic situation. So their children had to go and find income elsewhere. And they found it obviously in mines and timber industries, which paid them little or even had their own credit and money systems that could only be spent in company stores and company housing, holding their workers in a consistent state of liminal poverty. The class hierarchies, which had been set up at the beginning of the 19th centuries, differentiating between landholders and tenant farmers, basically intensified. And as a result of the widening gap between landholders and a lot of very poor people that couldn't find a way of redress in their desolate states, the tensions between workers and their employees rose, which led to the feuds and bloody wars in the mines. And although recent research definitely shows that there used to be a quite, functional legal system in most of the Appalachian territory and states, these systems did not hold up as nepotism and corruption overtook the order when wealthy landowners and mining companies used their money to gain political and legal influence in the region and obviously in Washington. Obviously, this is a very abbreviated history of the 19th century Appalachia. However, I believe the essentials are what matters. Many people who've come to the mountains at the beginning of the 19th century, seeking out a basic living in independence and peace, find themselves trapped in the same social processes of a developing nation as elsewhere on the American continent. What perhaps makes the region different from many others is the sort of combination of people who are caught up in the same place at the same time. And the stories and narratives that emerge from it are not so much the truth about the region and its people as they are a direct reflection of the new nation trying to understand these interactions and these meetings and what comes out of them. Some of the most popular narratives, therefore, are sort of the white, powerful, beautiful mountaineer who is a repository, which can be delved into, versus the degraded mountain man who produces children with his sisters. And these two extremes are sort of trying to make sense of why these people are poor, but also, making them still sort of an attractive source of labor and future Americans. The other one is sort of the noble Indians that live in this untouched region, and this beautiful landscape with the mountains versus the extreme sort of assimilation that takes place and the lands that can be conquered and exploited and that nobody cares about. Oh, and I did have a slide with us. So when we look at Appalachia, essentially, we need to think about it as a place where Indian removal is happening throughout the 19th century. So the original inhabitants of Appalachia are driven out. There's the Indian Removal Act. The last tribal gathering takes place in Red Clay, Tennessee, before the Trail of Tears begin. Cherokee women are losing their rights, but they're protesting their removal. So a lot of the writing that you can find about the region will be from or about Cherokee women trying to stop what's happening to their land and their people. And then also the dispersion of the remaining Cherokees, because not everybody left. What is now today the eastern band of the Cherokees are actually Cherokees that remained, and they have now tribal land on the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. So they stick around, and that's quite a large part of the population. At the same time, we have intense immigration by poor Irish people. We have also immigration waves from Scotland and Ireland, the infamous Scots-Irish, that populate every story about Appalachia ever told, but also a lot of Germans, and eventually also a lot of Eastern Europeans. We also have a lot of Black people that come to the coal camps and whose stories are lost, and there are currently a lot of initiatives that are trying to uncover the Black history of Appalachia. So actually, none of the publications that I can offer you as resources, you'll find them, but you'll find them on Instagram or on Twitter, and there's a bunch of like sort of oral histories that try to recover it. Then there's the Eastern European migration, which begins to outnumber other European countries. And these are people that are illiterate, that don't tell the stories, that are sort of become just part of the massive Appalachian story without ever being particularly a focus within literature or any writers being sort of collected about them. And obviously, as coal and timber become key industries in the mountains and textile in the Piedmont, those become an essential part of all stories. And then thankfully also unionization and labor movements. Okay, so that covers the 19th century. As I said, lots is going on. So what does writing Appalachia actually mean in that context? And what it means is there's lots of oral traditions, songs, music, as a form of expression for people who do not write. Regionalism emerges. There's a strong local color tradition associated with Appalachia, and I'll introduce you to some of the writers that are most prominent here. Local color usually means the use of dialect, or in the case of Appalachia, invented dialect, sort of romantic depictions of the people who live there, the story of outsider, insider, romantic stories of one woman from the outside falls in love as a strong mountaineer, very popular. Came out in lots and lots of literary journals, such as The Atlantic or Harper's Magazine. And you can actually watch movies that are based exactly on that same narrative, and Appalachia is where it comes from. You have a lot of travel writing because, as I said, reporters, missionaries come into the region to help the poor people of Appalachia, and they write about it. They tell stories about it. So you'll be able to find a lot of that as well. Sermons are very popular. Missionaries always come with Christianity. You'll find sermons by missionaries that joined the Cherokee, but also the poor coal camps. So there's a sort of interesting inter sort of mingling between unionization and Christianity, because the religion in the mountains that is most prominent is that sort of comes out of the second Great Awakening. So it's mostly Baptist, and Baptists don't believe sort of in a preacher, but the preacher is part of the community. So it's a very egalitarian type of religion. It takes weird turns. When you look into Appalachia, you'll find a lot about snake handling and people like sort of getting, voluntarily be bitten. But you'll find a lot of these narratives. And what these narratives sort of hide a little bit is how egalitarian this religion is. So everybody sort of has to find their own moment with God to become part of the group, but they're not outcasts because they haven't had it yet. So there's sort of the sense of like coming to terms with one another and the community, and that is found in the sermons that you'll find in the region. And then there's journalism, lots of journalism, and women find it it's sort of a sport for women to do that a little bit, and I'll introduce you to one of them in a moment. So yes, writing in Appalachia, mostly oral, but traditions, but also there's writing about and in the region. Okay, with that said, I'll introduce you to some of the women writers that do exist. And as I said, it's a selection of sorts because it's very much determined by books that I found, collections that have been written, so it's not complete in any sense of the word. I just picked out a few that I thought were sort of interesting. So the first one is Catherine Brown, and as you probably can tell by the hilarious image you see, she was Native. And one of the people that wrote about her, and there's also a memoir that she wrote, said about her is, "You would not distinguish her from well-educated females of the same age, either by her complexion, features, dress, pronunciation, or manners." What he's saying is she's passing for white, and she's really good at it. So she was very popular because she turned to Christianity, but she did so mostly because she was pulled out of her Cherokee community in which women sort of held groups and sort of had discussions among them, and the Christian mission that she ended up, which was buried in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was very dominated by women. So she quite enjoyed that new community that she found. And then she sort of saw Bible study as an opportunity to engage in women's circles. She was actually also very perceived to be very much caring about her appearances because she wore a lot of jewelry. And by the white Anglo-Saxon people that she was surrounded by, it was perceived as good that towards the end of her life, which was really short, by the way, because she died, as most of them, of a European disease. It was perceived that it was good that she was no longer wearing it. But from a Cherokee perspective, it's been sort of understood as her feeling less and less connected to her roots. Which also becomes very apparent in her sort of memoir that they published after. And they also really liked how she talked, which would have been very archaic English, closer to the British accent of the coastal elite than the Southern accent, because she actually learned it from the sort of first people to arrive in Appalachia, which were, early English and British settlers. The next one is Mary J. Harris' mother, Jones, was born 1837 and lived until 1930, so she's sort of a borderline 19th century, 20th century person, who was actually a dressmaker and born in Ireland, who became a teacher and then became a very militant but successful union organizer. She was a brilliant orator and activist whose speeches have been recorded by others. She did write a little bit, but not a lot, but you can find most of her texts. She's an iconic figure because she used to she used to go up into these coal towns that were essentially, well, modern plantations, and unionize the people there. And she would do so on her own. So this cute lady that you can see here, who actually tended to dress older and try to look older than she was. Like she was about in her 40s in this picture, but she looks like she's in her 60s or 70s, which was one of the strategies that she could actually um, enter and move around communities at the time and not be killed by anyone, including the miners, because they considered her a mother, and she would talk about the men and miners that she encountered as her boys. And you can see that in a lot of her speeches that she will imply sort of the motherly, we need to protect these communities. And that was one side of her. At the same time, she also welcomed violence whenever it was needed. And she was very popular, even among the political elites at the time. So she's kind of an interesting person, but again, not a writer in the classical sense, although she's very, very much there in all of the things that you'll find about Appalachian writing. Mary, and I am not sure how to say her middle name actually. I think it's Noise, Murphy, and I don't know why Bohr moved in there. She's called Murphy. I apologize. She was born 1815 in the Middle Tennessee, and in terms of Tennessee, thanks. Uh, in the Middle Tennessee is weird because it's not mountainous at all. It's like cattle country. So everything around Nashville is super flat. It has little to do with Appalachian culture. Still, she was one of the most prominent figures in the local color writing. She wrote essays and short stories, and her mountain knowledge, she at the end of her life sort of admitted, came from vacations at Beschäftigen Springs in Tennessee. And if that sounds remotely familiar, yes, J.D. Vance, who recently wrote the Appalachian Elegy, actually did the same thing. He spent his summers in the mountains and then claimed to know stuff about Appalachia. So also long tradition of people sort of spending time in the mountains, getting that tourist feeling, and then writing fundamental stuff about Appalachia that for the longest time, actually only probably until the 1970s, was considered true insight into the character and knowledge of mountaineers. So she's a very famous sort of writer in the local color fiction. Her texts are riddled with dialects and romantic plots. As I mentioned before, she really truly embraced the story of the outsider and insider falling in love. And in The Star in the Valley, which is one of her very short stories, it's truly that idea of like the woman in the mountain falling for the outsider, and then she tragically dies because the mountain ruggedness can never actually be combined with progress and modernity. Um, so it has to die eventually after providing sort of a romantic backstory. And you'll find that same equivalent narrative a lot. So in 1884, she published her most famous collection, which is called In the Tennessee Mountains. And the quote that I took from that is at the bottom of the slide: perhaps without any philosophy, she stood upon the basis of common humanity. To me, really exemplifies this notion of, oh, the good people of Appalachia, they're really dumb and very slow and have no education, but that makes them good people. They're the original common sense of America. And this understanding on the positive sort of stereotypes that are as harmful as the negatives sort of has been used over and over again. Simple is good because it's common. And then there's this sweet lady, Emma Bell Miles. She was born actually in Evansville, Indiana, and then moved to the area of Chattanooga, where she married someone from the region, so true mountaineer. She wrote a lot of poetry and prose. She never intended to publish it. However, her husband turned out to not be that great, and forced her to provide for the family by selling her writing. And her most famous book is The Spirit of the Mountains, which is sort of the female version of Horace Cappert's Our Southern Highlanders. And it's the same sort of story about women and men and romanticism versus modernity. It's less stereotypical, it's less sort of working in stereotypes, so I still prefer it over Horace Capert, but it still is obviously sort of this mountain literature kind of thing. And then there's Rebecca Harding Davis, and I feel like I think there's someone in this lecture series who talks about her to some more extent, so I'll just tell you that she exists. Born in 1813, actually in Pennsylvania, so the northern Appalachia. She was very fond of central and southern Appalachia and sort of her sense of social justice, which shines through, well, most importantly in Life in the Iron Mills, which is about Pennsylvania, but sort of fundamentally impacts her career, was also applied to the anti-Southern sentiments that became very strong in the 1870s and 80s in the North, that began to blame the South for everything and said that Southerners are terrible, while at the same time Northerners are investing money and exploiting Appalachia. Difficult sort of story. And she really hated that, so she tried to create characters from the Appalachian South that were multidimensional and that had good reasons for their sort of choices that weren't determined by being born in the isolationist mountains. So she's very interesting in that sense. Perhaps that was informed by her own life story because she got a college degree against all odds, and she was technically a working mom who published over 500 pieces. And then there are some more women that I'm not going to go into because, well, not a lot is known about them. So Fanny A. Fain wrote a lot of diaries about what it meant to live in the Civil War in the mountains. She was technically married to a man who came out of a plantation family, um, who opposed slavery and didn't want to be pulled into the Civil War, so he actually hid in the mountains. And her diary about managing living as a mother with children in the mountains with a husband who's a dissenter, are sort of really interesting to read, and to learn about women at the time in the mountains and in the Civil War. There are Sarah Butty and Mary Bryan Stapler Ross, who are Cherokee women that write letters across the lines. So they found themselves on different sides of the Civil War, and they write letters to their husbands at the same time, and to read them against each other was kind of an interesting thing. Then there's Hannah Worcester Hicks, who's one of the people that I mentioned that wrote a lot of mission reports. She was married into the Cherokee tribe, so her husband was Cherokee, she was not. She was actually the daughter of missionaries, and she lived on the Cherokee reservation and with Cherokees for a long time and wrote reports and diaries about it. And then there's Frances Leader Goodrich, who actually was a teacher from the North, who moved to the mountains as a missionary and then wrote semi-fictional sketches about mountain folks, which are amongst the writing that is most favorable, because she really tries to sort of show the independence, the hard workingness of the Appalachian people and sort of the complexities of what it meant. She's also one of the few writers that shows that within the Appalachian South, women were actually quite the community organizers and often led and directed life. Um, and that sort of took over whenever men were in the mines, which they were a lot, and organized the survival of the community. So she's one of the few ones that really shows that and sort of admires the women that she worked with, because she, as a teacher, she obviously worked with a lot of them. She's also representative of the women that came and established the settlement schools within Appalachia, of which there are still some left today, that brought education and literacy in greater numbers to the mountains. And with that, I just wanted to briefly share some final thoughts that I have about 19th century Appalachia. So while the writing by women, and really also by men, is not particularly noteworthy in terms of originality, its depth, or its particular splendor. I think it's interesting to look at because most of the narratives that we find about Appalachia, about mountain people, about rurality in in America, so therefore like some of the most essential American narratives comes out of that time. So if we want to understand sort of American narratives of good and common sense uh and righteousness, looking at Appalachian writers in the 19th century, both women and men, really can help us sort of understand where a lot of the narratology that determines American writings later on comes from. And I think that also a lot of the 19th century women writers cover sort of the horrors of the nation building happening at the time, which aren't covered in the more heroic stories that are written by men. So I think their testimony is an interesting addition, an interesting piece of the puzzle along the way. I hope that covers 19th century women writing in the Appalachian South. And I'm happy to like have a chat or discuss some issues that you feel are worth talking about.
Good, thank you, Eva. That was intense. That was very intense. So yes, so we learn a little bit about this very interesting area that is absolutely fascinating and vibrant and complex too, and secluded and still, very influential. I don't know. Yes, I can open up the discussion. So basically, your main clients are our students, and I have a couple of questions, but they have a couple of questions too, I hope. So I want them to go first. And just, so here you have a person who knows a lot about Appalachia, so go and ask her. You've heard of the place before, maybe? Or maybe it's your first exposure to this territory. I have no idea.
It probably is. It usually is. I'm always surprised. I'm so stuck deep in Appalachia that I keep forgetting that people outside of it don't care about it. So I'm not surprised if people haven't heard about it before.
Mm-hmm. Anne Scheibler has raised her hand. Yes, please.
Well, I think they call it the forgotten place, don't they? I mean, still to this day, it's I think the region that gets the least attention politically and financially. And what I found interesting is it reminds me a bit of they were just too busy to survive to write down their story, right? Kind of in a sense in people at other times when they just couldn't kind of build up a life next to surviving because it's such a poor country in the sense of it doesn't give a lot for a lot of work. So I guess that they created this huge oral history or oral tradition, which we can't get our hands on, or which probably a lot of has been lost. So
Yeah. So yes, it is a forgotten region in the sense of that it sort of gets pulled out as fragments whenever it's befitting. So for example, when Donald Trump won the 2016 election, everybody was like, oh, that's Appalachia. And I'm like, no, that's not Appalachia. That's part of it, but it's not all of it. So it gets pulled out, yes. So it's never understood as sort of a complex region with people who have differing opinions and differing thoughts and all of that. And you're completely right. Although there's this thing called the Appalachian Regional Commission, which receives, I think, about $340 million every fiscal sort of cycle. It's severely underfunded because there's not a lot of tax on coal. So you know, they're taking the richest out and leave none of the money. So it is systematically kept poor. And so, yes, survival continues to still be undermined, and you can see that throughout the literature that emerges from the region. And absolutely, oral history was sort of the only way that we can get to a lot of the things that are there today. I wouldn't consider their stories lost in that sense, but they've lost their specificity. So a lot of the things that we'll find today, or that, you know, are kept alive in the writing that exists about the region, or in the songs and the sermons and whatever, has sort of become generic because it's, you know, they try to keep the essence of what it means or meant to live in the mountains. And a lot of the artistic expressions that were created are more hands-on. So you have a quilt tradition, right? You have sort of the instrument tradition. So you have dulcimers, banjos, all of that are instruments that become their form that they are today in the Appalachian Mountains. So we have a lot more that remains of that. But in terms of, you know, actual like written, stylized history and texts and stories, you have a lot more of that in the cities because there's also no pen and ink or paper, right, to write it on. So everything from the fixture on trying to make a living, to survive, to being physically able to do that. You know, books, they'll sock through in cabins where the wind blows through, right? So, you know, why have books? You might use them to fire up your place when it gets real cold. So the only book that a lot of families have is the Bible, and they can't even read that most of the time. So you know, yeah, you're completely right. So it's the mindset, it's also the surroundings, and then what's left is those that made it out by some magical privilege, right?
Well, what I meant with lost to us, probably better word would be not accessible to people outside of the region. So I mean, you would have to travel into the region to experience their oral history and the music.
Yeah, because it's filtered to this, like, does it appeal to the masses? And a lot of it doesn't appeal to the masses. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. They cannot represent themselves, so they have to be represented by others, and they pay a price for it, of course, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that price has been very steep for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah.
I think it still is today, isn't it? I mean, if you hear anything about Appalachia, it's mostly that the truck trade, which it's a huge part in that region because it's one way to make money.
Yeah.
So it's also again a negative stereotype, just you know, creating that image or enforcing the image that has, you know, existed already. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, pharmaceutical companies didn't choose Appalachia for no reason as the ground to test out how far you can go with like a tablet of opium, right? So it's sort of this idea continues that uneducated people who are deplorable, in more sense than one. And that starts in the 19th century, you know, as they become impoverished. I mean, you know, don't get me wrong, the farmers that lived on the river bottoms weren't rich to begin with, but the sort of poverty that is created by modern capital progress is something completely else. I mean, it's sort of, you know, not, it's a difference between survival and subsistence, right? So this whole image of, you know, pull white trash sort of determines the region in so many ways. And to get anything out there, you know, it's usually that story, you know, the hillbillies, like the Beverly Hillbillies, I think was it called. You know, these stories, that's exactly the travel writing that's super popular in the 19th century Harper magazine today. So there's no change. So the price is steep, yeah, for representation.
thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was interesting. More questions? You know, you can test your own stereotypes against the knowledge of Eva, you know, who knows a little bit more about the area that we've all heard about, you know, usually scary stories about, you know, violent people.
Although I feel they're too young to have seen Deliverance.
Deliverance. I haven't
Yeah.
even seen Deliverance.
You have not seen.
That's
Okay,
a
so
movie?
Deliverance is based. So now we're jumping into the 20th century evil, but it's the beginning of the 20th century, so I feel like we can cheat a little bit. It's based on a story, or on a book really, by a Southern author, called Deliverance, and there was a movie in I think the 1970s or 80s,
Mm-hmm.
about it, and in essence, it's like middle-class white Americans coming to the region, encountering devious, degenerate people who then like do things in the wilderness to them, including like rape, and they all die. And it the most famous thing is that during these scenes, you hear the boy from the beginning who plays the banjo, sort of play in the background. And that's sort of exactly that's how a lot of people felt about Appalachia. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not based on Texas, it's based on Appalachia.
Okay.
It's, smart, youthful, healthy people coming to the dark region, and then they're murdered in the most horrendous circumstances because they go for the cabin in the woods. So a lot of these horror stories, this gothic, comes out of that.
Mhm.
I keep forgetting what his name is. Ah, one of the most famous sort of horror and gothic writers actually comes from the region, although he didn't explicitly write about it. But it's sort of that horror that transcends, and becomes an essential element of horror for all American stories.
Mm-hmm. I mean, historically, what you described very well is that difference between the southern mountains and the Virginia flatlands where the rich people lived, right? So,
Yeah.
and then the absentee ownership, which I think is really interesting. You know, I think even Faulkner's Sot Pen is basically a guy who comes from this area and who wants to make it on the plantation, probably to some extent, and it shows that tension, you know, between the rich people, you know, whom we considered, you know, the noble blood of the South, you know, all of these educated people on their plantations who were actually slave owners, and they didn't only oppress the black slaves, but they also controlled the lives of these people in the mountains. Um, uh, who then had to live with whatever was left, you know, because all the rest of the land belonged to the rich planters.
Yeah. Well, but also like a lot of the absentee owners were located in Washington, D.C.
Even, okay.
So it's a lot of northern elites that, as I said, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they all had land but never went. And then they
Okay.
used it in the big crash in the 1920s. They lost a lot of it and sold it to other people. So a lot of the land ownership that people in Appalachia are struggling today is based in this, like, it was given to war heroes. And it was just like tracts of land. They didn't even know what it looked like on a map. They had just like drawn up this like random areas and written down, this is Thomas
Mhm.
Jefferson's land. So
Okay.
so it's not just like plantation owners in the lowlands, it's also people across the Americas.
Okay. People in the north, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
only southern planters, you think.
Also
Okay.
people who went back to England.
Even.
So yeah. So I mean, this applies more to the lower parts of it that are technically not truly, like they're debatably Appalachian. But one of the reasons we find so many chemical plants that are these days run by massive global agglomerates, um, in the hands of like Indian companies has to do with the fact that this land was given and owned by British aristocracy, that fought on the independent side, but then went back to England anyways. So
Mm-hmm.
so there's the ownership in Appalachia is mostly outside the region, and it does transfer even across the Atlantic.
Okay. Could they keep the land if they were on the wrong side? because you know in the American War of Independence, what happened very often is that there were gigantic landowners who were loyalists, and then they lost the war, and they basically also lost the land because that was simply taken away from them and redistributed among the nationalists.
Yeah, a lot of that is true, but a lot of them kept it
Some
because they
conceded.
might,
Okay.
yeah, because I mean, most of them then immigrated and became part of the, because, you know, there were some that were really defending the crown, and then there were those that, you know, ended up just remaining and buying up land. And I mean, because sort of in a sense, the expansion westward was way better organized and controlled than sort of the expansion in the mountains. So there's a lot of papers that pertain to the same place, and sort of sorting that out. By the time they had to sort it out because coal companies wanted to take out the coal. It was really who had the most money to get the best lawyers. So you have deeds to land that overlap, and sort of the legal battles that then also caused some of the feuds that became so popular in, you know, newspapers and in flashy articles, pertain exactly to that. So rich landowners that at this point have all immigrated to the United States or even in England fight over it, and they employ the local population to fight this war for them. So it's brother against brother because, you know, they're promised jobs and influence and power if they maintain the deed.
Okay.
So it's very much a puppet war.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I'm thrilled that you're mentioning Rebecca Harding Davis. I didn't really know that she was actually from that area. I'm the person who was talking about the iron mills, and I just know the iron mills as a fantastic text, you know, that was published in the Atlantic Monthly, and it has a very interesting criticism of the industrial situation that comes very early. I think it's 1860 or something when it was published. And it has a lot of interesting Christian imagery in the background. And it's really interesting because it's making these accusations, you know, against the northern type of industrialization. I don't know much of her other writing, so this is good to know that, and it's probably worth going into. There's just so much interesting stuff to read.
Yeah.
So have you read any of her other, like maybe did she write short stories?
Yeah.
Or
She wrote a bunch of short stories that are collected. She also wrote some sort of semi-fictional essays. And some of, especially her later work, because I mean, Life at the Iron Mills takes place in Pennsylvania, I remember,
I
right?
think so, yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of that was actually influenced by her visiting the Piedmont textile industry, so the of Southern Carolina, South Carolina, and North Carolina. So sort of engaging with that as well. So she knew that these textile mills weren't just a thing, and the iron that the iron mills weren't, you know, a singular event, but that they were matched by the textile mills in the South and sort of the salt works. And there's some very specific minerals that are mined and then created in West Virginia and Virginia, and she knew about all of this. So these experience and this sort of getting to know all of that really influenced a lot of work, and that comes even more through in her short stories. And also she was really pissed about the sort of, you know, anti-Southern sentiment. It wasn't that she was apologetic about slavery, I think, because I think there's a lot of criticism that you know, her being offended by that was based on that. I think it was her understanding that the sort of social injustices that were happening in the iron mills were matched by exactly what was happening in the South as well. So she could see that. I think her anger was sort of this like, oh, we're better than this, and then it's really, no, you're not, because it's happening and you're sort of driving it in the textile mills, in the salt works, in the coal mines as well. So I think
Well,
that's
for me, you know, when people talk about industrial slavery, you know,
yeah.
which was one of these arguments in the post-war debates, you know, used by the Southerners. So I think life in iron mills is a typical example of this type of text that illustrates, you know, a slavery type of situation or state of these proletarian people working in the mines.
Yeah.
Sorry, mills. Yeah.
Yeah. But in the essence, I mean, it's so bizarre because, you know, we're talking about the 19th century, but when you look at the situation today, it doesn't matter whether you're a miner or in a mill or, you know, in the ironworks. You're exposed to the same sort of horrible workplace safety regulations that are constantly being transgressed. So I think Davis was sort of interesting in that she saw that even then,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and she saw that it didn't make a difference. Sort of south versus north. It's the same situation. People are being exploited in the same ways. So I
Mm-hmm.
mean, these coal towns that spring up all over the mountains, they're essentially a form of slavery because the people are hired. They're not paid money. They're paid in weird sort of coins and credits that can only be used in the company stores. Their children are
Mm-hmm.
going to company schools. They're attending church service every Sunday in the company church.
Yeah.
So they become in parts of a system that isn't that different from
The company
slavery.
is like a plantation
Yeah,
in that sense. Yeah,
yeah.
it has a very similar type of story.
And
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense because at the time, we're talking about the 19th century, so especially up to the mid 19th century, yeah, Irish people weren't considered white people, right? So you have
Yeah.
that sort of racial aspect that explains also why, you know, that would have been conceived as being okay. Because they're
Mm-hmm.
somewhat less than white people. Here then comes the Civil War, and all of a sudden, you know, they need these like magical white people to set them up against the black people. I haven't mentioned this, but sort of because it sort of happens in the 20th century, but Appalachia is sort of a breeding ground for integrated interracial protest against social injustices and, you know, political elites, both locally and in Washington, need a way to corrupt this interracial alliance. So what they do is they lift up Scots Irish people in the Appalachian Mountains to the status of good white people and set them up against their sort of lesser people from Eastern Europe and the black people and the indigenous people and those that mixed with them in the mountains. So it's sort of this, because of Appalachia's origins as a place where so many people came together and interweaved through marriage, through, you know, the shared experience of poverty, it's natural that they feel oppressed by the elites on the coast, and that is sort of dissolved from, you know, how they look for the
Mm-hmm.
longest time. So somebody has to come and introduce that notion of racial purity to sort of separate that. And I mean, one of the great things is Berea College, which is in Kentucky, in Berea, Kentucky, where, for example, Bell Hooks comes from also, um, is opened in 1865, and it's an integrated college in Kentucky in the middle of like
An old
post-Civil
slave state.
Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was
So
integrated from the beginning.
it was integrated from the beginning. It was separated afterwards, so it's complicated. It sort of has a complicated history, but it was always attempted to be an open place for everybody.
Okay. Which leads me to the next question. What about hope for the Appalachian region? You know, because you get this sense of eternal repetition, you know, of moving from disaster into disaster. You know, you talk about the horrors of nation building and you know, and then you have J.D. Vance who talks about hillbillies and
Dying.
yeah, and you sort of wonder, you know, is there any way out? Or you have these democratic senators who then basically decide to vote, you know, with the Republicans because they want to have more support for coal. You know, I mean, very conservative kind of things. And you wonder, is this ever going to change? Is there any kind of education or progress possible in any direction?
I mean, that's literally what my current research is about. So this is leaving the 19th century, right? Um, is that very question is, does hope grow in a place like this? And I I mean, one of the people that I interviewed for my research said, you know, Appalachia has been in decline for so long. We develop an expertise at decline. And it's sort of this idea that I think why it's important to look at literature is this powerful narrative of decline and destruction and the end of things that dominates Appalachia from the beginning
Mm-hmm.
is falsifying, in a sense, eliminating the space for hope, although it has existed. Because you can also obviously look at Appalachia the other way around and say, 19th century, it's the mountains. There's no reason why people should write or create music or do anything artistic, and yet they do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is a very active folk culture, obviously, that
Yeah.
is famous for the fiddling and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And this culture is profoundly American.
Yeah, yeah.
In the sense of, it combines the indigenous influences with, the banjo that came from Africa and the dulcimer that came from Germany and makes it into something entirely new. And I think this whole situation of people sort of reclaiming the space and the people from this horrible narrative of decline and destitution
Mm-hmm.
is the hope that also starts at the same moment. It
Mm-hmm.
is sort of people like Rebecca Harding Davis and, Murphy who, say, wait a minute. There is so much more than these, crazy, flashy newspaper articles about Appalachians killing other Appalachians. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where the hope comes from. And that's where sort of the progress comes from. And in a sense, to me, Appalachia has always been sort of a microcosm, right? As I sort of try to explain, what happens in Appalachia preempts, reflects, tells the story of actual nation building, which is painful and destructive and really horrid most of the time. And it tells it very densely,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't make it pretty, which a lot of the stories that have become popular American fiction really do, right? And for the most of the time, Americans and even like everybody else sort of learns only about the pretty rags to riches story, when the truth is more complex. So I feel like Appalachia is essential and actually contributes to the betterment of the American nation by telling that story, because it
Mm-hmm.
says like this is what really happens, and we need to address it and understand um
And
what it
we
means.
need to face it. And I
Yeah,
mean, I even think nowadays with the whole Trump situation, the American nation is facing, a lot of the poor white population, that has been ignored, I guess, for a long time.
yeah,
And at least, people are taking this seriously, and they say, we have to figure out what happened to these people and what kind of lifestyle they have, and what kind of options they have or don't have, especially, right?
yeah, yeah. And yeah, and Appalachia offers sort of the place to look at it much more unfiltered than perhaps other
Absolutely.
stories do.
Uh-huh.
So while, in a lot of the American literature in the 19th century and onwards, you need to read between the lines to understand the darkness. Appalachia sort of
Mhm.
offers you the darkness, and
Straight
yeah, and you look in
Straightforward.
between. Yeah, and then you look in between the lines and you find the hope.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I sort of think that's such an interesting thing to sort of have to dig through the darkness and understand there's also light in it.
Uh-huh. 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 Oh, that's fantastic. Good. No, that was you're talking about lots of interesting stuff. I only knew Mother Jones as a magazine.
Yeah, that's
I
actually
had
built on her though.
I had some leftist friends who were peddling Mother Jones. This was sort of a socialist magazine that was considered revolutionary, that people were reading,
She was a bit of
on
a
the American
controversial.
left.
Yeah, she's actually a bit of a controversial figure, which is I think so telling about the American left too, because she was a violent anti suffragist. She didn't believe, like, one of her most famous quotations is, "You don't need the vote to raise hell." But she, she meant positively, but she was like, "Don't waste your time." Like she was perhaps one of the first critics of like white American feminism that was geared towards middle-class white people, because she's like, ah, you don't need all of that BS. Like you can fix the world and the problems through other means.
Okay.
So she wasn't very popular among her peers at the time because she was very, very present. Like presidents met with her when they happened to be in the same place, but she wasn't for the vote. So,
Mhm. Oh, wow.
um,
Fascinating.
yeah. And at the same time, she's this sweet little lady who walks up, Pike Mountain, and like there's this really famous story, and it's in Writing Appalachia, where she held her hand to the guns of the militia that was hired to protect against unionization, and she like brought in her organizers, and she just did that. And she was like that a lot of times. She would sort of unionize people in the faraway places that the main American union had given up on, and she would do that. So it makes sense that she's such an icon in the region, but at the same time, at her time, she wasn't that popular.
Mm-hmm.
So she was
Mm-hmm.
like important for sort of the history of the unions and organizing labor. But at the same time, of course, she was a complex figure. She was like very human.
Sure.
Yeah. And she had to find her own strategies, dressing like an old lady so people wouldn't kill her or rape her or whatever.
That's hilarious. That's very interesting. Very interesting disguise.
Yeah.
Perfect. Any more questions from the floor? I'm just basically throwing up everything I happen to know, all the stereotypes about Appalachia, which are probably exactly the bad stuff that you've been fighting against all the time, because that's all we know.
Yeah.
That's all we know. I mean, I know I saw years ago, I saw this documentary called Harlan County, USA,
Mhm.
which was a,
Makes sense.
very famous documentary about labor fighting, and it was basically also about all the violence when the people take out guns, and I think a couple of people get killed and all that.
Yeah.
And all I remember is that intensity of the labor fighting, when it was really vicious. But it doesn't show any silver lining from what I understand. I remember about this movie. It was just, you know,
Yeah. It
some,
bases into violence. It makes sense, yeah.
yeah.
Some of the most traditional songs that are from the region that are now like pop culture items.
Hmm.
Like one of them has a line, I think it's even called "You'll Never Leave Harlan Alive." Because you
Okay.
either die in the mines, you get shot, or you starve to death, which, it still is
Wow.
probably true for about 30% of the population in Harlan County, because Harlan County is still one of the poorest counties in Kentucky.
Yeah, I drove through it once, I remember,
Yeah.
and I didn't know where to stop exactly. It's the kind of place where people live in houses where they have the fridge on the porch somewhere.
Yep.
Uh,
That's the outside fridge, though. Not to be confused with the inside fridge.
Oh, they have two
Um,
fridges. Ah, okay. I don't know enough about that culture.
It's
Okay.
it's an interesting one, and if you dive into it, I think that's also so symptomatic of what these narratives that have been sort of in the making for such a long time, have had. People feel physically uncomfortable in the region,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I ventured into it, somewhat naively, but I still had that same thing, right? I heard the banjo play in the back of my head all the time, but sort of the encounters that I had were all friendly and respectful and
Okay. Good.
very helpful. And it's sort of this idea that this has been lost. And some of the writers that I mentioned, they try to recover that, right? They say, oh, they might seem a little weird at the beginning, but they have good reasons for what they do. And they're usually kind and oriented towards people, but obviously also strangers coming in, taking their land, using their stories and their images
Yep.
to create this narrative of deplorables and degeneracy hasn't exactly made them, the most trusting in strangers.
Of course. Of course. Of course. We've just had a PhD defense on the Zuni Indians, who are supposed to be very closed off and protecting themselves against outsiders and probably had very similar experiences.
Yeah.
So that exists not only among exotic, Native Americans in the Southwest, but it can also, exist in countries that have a very old European population, actually, that has been treated in similar ways, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, and yeah, it makes sense, Being
Yeah.
treated like white trash doesn't exactly make you good people.
Yeah. Now, okay, if nobody else intervenes, I can ask anyway. You also read 20th century stuff from the region, obviously.
Yes.
So is there more of a possibly genuine voice available, where you don't just have foreigners appropriating their cause and then putting all kinds of stereotypes across the landscape. So is there a literature nowadays that is possibly a little bit more, the word genuine is very problematic, but
Yeah.
relevant.
Yes. So, which most people don't know is, the American philosopher Bell Hooks was born and raised in Kentucky,
Mm-hmm.
and her book Belonging actually talks about the Kentucky upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the most sort of important parts of that story is how she describes that she grew up in rural Kentucky, so up in the mountains, far removed from cities and schools, but um and then she is forced to move into the city, and she says she didn't know race until she moved to the city.
Okay, which is amazing. Yeah.
Something that we don't associate, right, with the mountains being sort of, not as caught up in sort of racial domination and all of that. So she's fantastic. There is also lots of fiction. Silas House, for example. I think his first book, he started writing in the 90s. Who's a gay activist and lives in Kentucky with his partner,
Mm-hmm.
close to Berea, and writes about
Isn't the notion of Kentucky a little bit problematic? Because I remember that not all of Kentucky is Appalachia. I mean, I
Yeah,
remember Kentucky as this place, where we looked at beautiful horse farms and fantastic stallions and Kentucky Derby culture. That is a totally different part of the same state, isn't it? So
yeah.
there seems to go a division right through the state.
Yeah. So again, I sometimes forget to think about Kentucky in that way too, right? Yes. So one half of it is Appalachian Kentucky, and then there's Louisville, Kentucky. Let's call it that way. So where
Okay.
where the horses are, it is dissimilar in a lot of ways, but then it's also very similar in a lot because all of Kentucky has sort of a hidden black history. The black jockeys of
Okay.
Kentucky have had a strong tradition until the I think 30s or 40s even. So the loss of that history and sort of the loss of black jockeys in America has a lot to do with that sort of split. But so yes, yeah, Kentucky is split, but I mean Mountain Kentucky and regular Kentucky are linked through a lot of history as well. And Silas House is from Eastern Kentucky, so he's from the Mountain Kentucky.
Okay.
Um, he's good writing. Dorothy Ellison is from Appalachian, South Carolina, so she's from the Piedmont region.
Mm-hmm.
She does write about that. She's like one of those authors who addresses the question of poor white trash a lot and sort of humanizes them, especially with a view on Piedmont and in South Carolina. Um, who else? Like, I feel like I'm forgetting all of them right now.
That's okay. That's okay. So you give us this very enormous survey over an interesting area. What was the exact focus of your PhD project then? You cannot do all of this.
No, I don't. I really focus on southern and central Appalachia, but only where it's mountainous. And because I said, my Appalachia is sort of to be found on the map, so I used the predefined Appalachian parts by the Appalachian Regional Commission that was subbed up in 1965 to remedy the underdevelopment in the region. And that has grown since. But since my exact sort of time slot is 1996 to 2016, I use that definition most of the time. But my work isn't necessarily based on distinctive places as much as sort of the larger construct of the social cultural Appalachia. I'm not as bound to maps as some other people are. So I cover a lot of these bigger stories of, coal exploitation, industrial servitude, new economies, the diversification, what does leadership in the mountains mean? I just like I've interviewed 31 people now that come from all parts of that area.
So you did
And
like oral history stuff almost.
yeah, almost, yeah. I did semi-structured narrative interviews,
Mm-hmm.
where people just, responded to questions about why Appalachia? Why do what you do there and not somewhere else? Why stay in the region? Why come back to the region? Because most of them have some prior connection to it. So most of that really traditional story of growing up in the region, leaving to get an education, maybe have a job outside, and then being called back to the mountains. Because even today, and I think it shines through most of the writing, you are either from Appalachia or you're not.
Okay.
So there's sort of this very strong identification with the region, both in a positive or a negative.
Okay.
So yeah, and they share a lot of the stories and the narratives about legitimizing their work in the region. I mean, one of the things that I find always fascinating is that they speak about the mountains as family members.
Okay. Oh, that's amazing.
Mm.
Cool. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge about this fascinating territory.
Sure.
In the east, but not exactly East Coast.
Yeah, the key is it's not coast. I think the
Exactly.
moment you remove the true divisions of America are not political or sort of geographical, they're about coast versus interior.
Yep. Excellent. Okay, we had a great conversation. Thank you, Eva. Is there anybody who still, wants to ask a few more things or has a comment to make about your experiences? I have no idea how much all of you know about that, but the Appalachian region, if you've ever been there or heard about things. Of course, everybody's background is a little bit different. I perfectly see that. But we really were lucky that today we got exposed to an expert, who was telling us with a lot of energy about all of the exciting stuff that we can learn about this definitely very rich area. I mean, I remember the music, you didn't talk too much about the music, but this is extremely intense. There's a lot of, if you are a folk musician, this is paradise. You consider this to be, one of the richest areas in the United States, where there's a lot of musical heritage and activity and all that.
And it's storytelling in its true sense.
That part too. Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Eva. That
You're
was
welcome.
exciting. Let's give her a hand. And I hope I see you guys in the new year. So what I can do is wish you all a happy new year. Thank you for keeping us company every Thursday night. So the next meeting is it on the 17th of January? And I realized that's when I have to be able to tell you something about a couple of minority women in the United States. And I also realized that I cover these people as realists, and I look at them as 19th century people, and then I find out they possibly also write in the early 20th century. I'm not perfectly clear about the dates here sometimes, but in a sense, you know, anything before modernism is very often considered 19th century and realism, etc., etc. So anyway, doesn't matter. These are interesting people, and I think I will be able to tell you a little bit about, you know, Chinese American and Native American, and hopefully also about Jacob's, you know, the Black American story, which is also very interesting. Cool. Thank you very much. Enjoy your Christmas break. Recover a little bit from all of the stress and all of these intense classes and the intense life. And it's been good seeing you. I hope I see you next year again. Take care.